It happens to me all the time, and it happened just this week. A young person I'd never met introduced himself to me and said that when he saw our guest today on an earlier episode of this program, he felt he was seeing a man who knew how to think. Dr. Thomas Sowell on Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Thomas Sowell has studied and taught economics, intellectual history, and social policy at institutions that include Cornell, Brandeis, UCLA, and Amherst. Now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Dr. Sowell has published more than a dozen books, including the classic A Conflict of Visions. Coming soon, a revised edition of his most recent volume, Discrimination and Disparities. Tom Sowell, welcome.
Thank you.
You grew up in Harlem, dropped out of high school to join the Marine Corps during the Korean War, received an undergraduate degree from Harvard, a master's from Columbia, and your doctorate from the University of Chicago. All of which pales by comparison with the fact that you once tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers. But during this period, from Harlem to the University of Chicago, throughout your 20s, you've said, you spent most of the decade of your 20s as a Marxist.
Yes.
Why? What was the attraction?
Well, I guess I first was very puzzled. See, there's one little correction I would make. At age 16, I was a dropout, high school dropout, and I went to work full time as a Western Union messenger.
Delivering telegrams.
Delivering telegrams.
We better say that because there will be a generation that won't know what Western Union was. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's true too.
Right.
And so I worked in the area of Manhattan called the Chelsea District, which is around 23rd Street, 9th Avenue. And at the end of the day, I had several ways of getting back home. The easiest and fastest way was with a subway, which was a nickel in those days. When I was feeling flush, I might go for a bus for a dime. And when I was really getting reckless, I would take the Fifth Avenue bus, which was the elite of the buses, was 15 cents. And so I would walk over to Fifth Avenue, take that bus, and it would take me up through all the glamorous parts of Fifth Avenue, past the Empire State Building, past the great stores and things of that sort. And then on 57th Street, it would turn, and this is just the elite part of town.
Sure, right there where the park starts.
Yes, and then this park starts at 59th.
Oh, sorry.
57th, I would turn over, again, the same kind of scene, past Carnegie Hall,
right,
Columbus Circle, there was no Trump Tower at that time, and on up to about 72nd Street, and go out to Fifth Avenue, out to Riverside Drive, which is another elite area, and so for miles after that, you'd have all these wonderful luxury apartment buildings and so on. And finally, around 129th or 30th Street, it would go on a long viaduct. And then he would do a right turn back into the occupied area, and there you'd see the tenements. And I would wonder, why is this? I mean, why this huge disparity? And there was nobody else. There was no other explanation around. There was nothing. There was nothing there other than Marxism. I stumbled across. I had not read Marx. But I bought a secondhand set of encyclopedias, small set, for some ridiculously low price. And I looked up Karl Marx. I'd heard the name, and the stuff that he said seemed to make sense. And then later on, I would get more and more into it. The argument was that the rich had gotten rich by taking from the poor.
Right.
And well, that was one explanation. But what is interesting, there was no other explanation out there really, and that's true largely in our colleges, universities today.
But so by the time you went to Harvard undergrad, you drop out at the age of 16, and you start reading Marx in your late teens.
I start reading Marx, yes, 1949, at age 19.
Age 19, and then you were in the Marine Corps for a couple of years. What was it? 2-3 years?
2 years. It was actually 1 year, 11 months, and 5 days, but who's counting?
But who's counting? All right, so by the time you went to Harvard, you had already become intellectually engaged with Marxism.
Yes.
And Harvard didn't talk you out of it, and the study of economics at Harvard didn't talk you out of it, nor did getting a master's at Columbia, nor did getting a doctorate at Chicago dissuade you from Marxism. Is that? And you studied with Milton Friedman of all people. How could you have sat in Milton Friedman's classroom and remained a Marxist?
Some people are just stubborn. But what really changed me was not the University of Chicago. It was my first job working in a professional capacity for the government. I was a summer intern.
This is after Chicago?
Or No, while I was still a graduate student.
Got it.
And so during the summer vacation, I worked in the U.S. Department of Labor, and I began to realize, from a number of things, that the government is not simply the personification of the general will like Rousseau or others. The government is an institute. The government institutions have their own institutional interests. One involved the minimum wage law. I was a big supporter of that. But I also knew that there was an argument that minimum wage laws simply priced low-wage workers out of a job. Mm-hmm. And my first assignment dealt with minimum wages in Puerto Rico. And as I looked at the numbers, I would see as they would jack up the minimum wages, the number of jobs would go down and so forth. But there were two explanations. One was that of the economists, that you priced the people out of a job, and the other was that there were hurricanes that had come to Puerto Rico. You see, during the sugar harvesting, and I was studying the sugar industry, and therefore it destroyed a lot of the crop. Therefore, you wouldn't hire as many workers. Now, in Chicago, I'd been taught that if there are two different theories, there should be some empirical evidence in principle that could distinguish what would happen under one theory from what would happen under the other.
Right.
And so I wrestled with that for most of the summer. And one morning I came in and I said, I got it. What we need are data on the amount of sugar cane standing in the fields before the hurricane struck. And as I waited for the congratulations, I could see stricken looks around me in the room. Like, this guy has stumbled on something that will ruin us all. You know? And they said, well, we don't have those data. I said, oh, I'll bet the Department of Agriculture has it. And he said, well, but that doesn't mean we have it. You'd have to have a request go up the chain of command to the Secretary of Labor. He would then confer with the Secretary of Agriculture. It would come down the chain of command in the Department of Agriculture to whoever has those numbers, and so on. I said, good. Well, they say a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, so I will now submit my request to the Secretary of Labor, which I did. And I am still patiently awaiting this reply.
And the institutional fear of the number was what? That it would...
the U.S. Department of Labor administers the minimum wage law.
I see.
And the money and the careers of perhaps a third or some other significant percentage of the Labor Department's resources come from administering the minimum wage law. One of the real farces of all this is that the law itself, Section 4D, I still remember, requires the Labor Department to study the employment effects of minimum wages. And those studies are absolutely a farce. In fact, some years after I left, I did an article saying why those studies were a farce. And when I came back later on to the Labor Department to do some research, one of the older librarians who remembered me turned to the younger librarian and she said, this is the man who wrote that article that has everybody up in arms.
So you began to be dissuaded of Marxism.
And of government in general, because the government is not out there at the personification of the national interest.
Right.
They have their own interests, and the Labor Department was clearly an interest in keeping the minimum wage because that's their jobs and careers.
All right.
And power.
Which brings us, if I may, to one of my favorite books, your 2000 book. This is a beat-up old copy. Mm-hmm. This book, Conflict of Visions.
Yes.
Which you published in 2007, and you lay out. I'm sorry.
1987.
I beg your pardon. 1987.
Reprinted in 2007.
Well, beat up as this book is, it turns out this is a reprint. Sorry, 1987, and you lay out two competing ways of looking at economics and politics. Really, two competing ways of looking at life that go back at least 200 years: the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. The constrained vision, I'm quoting from A Conflict of Visions, sees the evils of the world as deriving from the limited and unhappy choices available, given the inherent moral and intellectual limitations of human beings, close quote. So the constrained vision understands itself as constrained by the limitations of reality itself.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
In other words, they cannot proceed as so many do, that good things happen automatically, but bad things are somebody's fault.
Got it. And then to continue here, the constrained vision, again, quoting from A Conflict of Visions, for the amelioration, improvement of the human condition, the constrained vision relies on certain social processes such as moral traditions, the marketplace, or families, not government. So explain that. Why do we rely on processes rather than the will of the people instituting changes to improve our condition?
Well, it doesn't ignore government. Even for the market to work, you have to have a government, as Europe discovered when the Roman Empire collapsed, and the economies collapsed also. But I guess one of the reasons would be that with the government, you have surrogate decision makers, and they cannot possibly know as much as the individuals whose personal decisions have been preempted.
I see. All right, which brings us to the unconstrained vision. When, again, I'm quoting you, when Rousseau said that man is born free but everywhere in chains, he expressed the essence of the unconstrained vision, in which the fundamental problem is not nature or man, but institutions.
Yes.
Would you explain that one?
Well, he has the notion that, that good things happen naturally. And if they're bad things, it's because institutions, including civilization itself, have made these bad things happen. And of course, and I think that's really the implicit assumption behind a lot of things that are said on the left today. And why in my most recent book I go to a lot of trouble to show that in nature there's nothing resembling equal opportunity. That wherever you look around the country, around the world, you find people who live up in the mountains, poor and backwards, even in the richest countries. Including the United States. I believe the poorest country in the United States, the county rather, was in a mountain community, which was almost 100% white.
Somewhere in Appalachia, West Virginia, Southern Ohio. Right.
Yes. And that men in that county had a life expectancy 10 years less than men in a county in Virginia.
And the unconstrained vision says, let's fix that. Surely we can pass a law that would improve that. And the constrained vision says, well, now wait a moment. If people who live in isolated pockets in mountains are poor and backwards all around the world, and we see this pattern over and over and over again, maybe there's something very deeply rooted in reality about that that's hard for us to get at. Correct?
Yes.
All right. So in the book, A Conflict of Visions, you're very dispassionate and very analytical, and you lay out the unconstrained vision, and you lay out the constrained vision, and you don't really come out blazing in favor of one or the other.
No, that is not a book meant to show that one vision is better than the other. It's there to show you what they are and what you're assuming if you go one direction or another.
Okay.
And it's to encourage people to understand the implicit assumptions behind all this, without which you're just at loose ends.
All right. So, pondering all this, I noticed something, a column that you wrote, this is a couple of years ago, in which you rebutted Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. And Kristof had described the gaps between African Americans and whites in America, gaps in wealth, gaps in educational achievement, the usual gaps, to, and this is a quotation from Kristof, to the lingering effects of slavery, close quote.
Oh, yes.
And here's Tom Sowell, quote, if we wanted to be serious about evidence, We might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state. In other words, we could compare hard evidence on the legacy of slavery with hard evidence on the legacy of liberals, close quote. And so there it is, life is hard. You use the word hard, you use the word serious, you use evidence. Tom Sowell is a man of the constrained vision through and through and through, correct?
Yes.
No.
Yes, part of a vanishing breed, I might add.
So when you were a Marxist, the notion, explain that, because the Marxism.
Well, but no, you see,
so that's complicated.
Even when I was a Marxist, I had the same intellectual standards.
Right.
And that's what eventually led me away from it.
Oh, I see.
In other words, I hadn't done all the research. I hadn't gone around the world
looking for evidence.
Yes.
Okay. So
socialism is a great idea. That does not mean it's a great reality. One of the things that disturbs me tremendously is about this enthusiasm for Bernie Sanders and socialism at a time when people are literally starving in Venezuela, an oil-rich country. And they're breaking into grocery stores to try to get food, and they're fleeing to neighboring countries, most of which are not all that prosperous themselves, but at least you don't starve to death in them. And none of that makes a bit of difference. Mm-hmm. I don't think most of these people who are out there cheering for Bernie Sanders have given a thought to Venezuela.
To the evidence.
That's right.
To the evidence.
Yeah.
All right. Which brings us to something that you refer to in a number of columns as the retrogression, the experience of African Americans in this country. Economic progress, I'm quoting you. Despite the grand myth that black economic progress began or accelerated with the passage of the civil rights laws and the war on poverty programs of the 1960s, the fact is that the poverty rate among blacks fell from 87% in 1940 to 47% in 1960. But over the next 20 years, the poverty rate among blacks fell another 18 percentage points. This was just the continuation of a previous economic trend, but at a slower rate of progress. It was not some grand deliverance, close quote. That is so counter to what we are taught in school, what appears on the editorial pages of newspapers, that I feel as though I want to ask you, you really want to stick with that assertion?
I have more evidence in my most recent book, Discrimination and Disparities. I point out that this really is a pattern not peculiar to blacks or even to the United States, that you can see the same thing in England, you can see it in any number of other countries, that the poor were much worse off economically, let's say in the first half of the 20th century, and yet in terms of their own behavior, they were far more decent societies, and afterwards, after this welfare state is supposed to make them better off and better human beings, that's when the crime rate skyrocketed on both sides of the Atlantic. The British were famous for being perhaps the most polite, considerate society in the world. Prior to that, after that, you get things like the 2011 riots over there, went through London, Manchester, where they're going through this. They anticipated Ferguson and Baltimore by a few years. And the same thing is the burning down of buildings, the throwing of gasoline bombs, the whole smear. And none of those people were descendants of slaves.
So the poor people were doing, if the lesson of the 20th century is something like poor century African Americans were improving their lot and leading fundamentally decent lives until the government decided to help them.
Yeah, yes.
That's a fair statement.
Well, they're better off economically because of what's been given.
Right.
But of course, when you have the crime rate, I mean, I got the first inkling of this some years back when I was at some school in Harlem doing some research. And I had looked out the window and I mentioned in passing that when I was a little kid, I used to walk my dog in that park, and looks of horror came over students' faces. Nobody in his right mind would have a child go into that park, walking a dog or not. the principal was warning these students not to cross this park, which was about a block and a half wide, even in groups of 6. And when I tell them about how in these hot summer nights I would sleep out on the fire escapes in Harlem, they looked at me like I was a man from Mars. People were doing that all over New York. They were doing it in Philadelphia, Washington, wherever I've known people. That was a common thing for poor people. We didn't have the money for air conditioning.
Right.
You slept out on the fire escape or in the parks. Where Walter grew up
Walter Williams.
Walter Williams grew up in a housing project in Philadelphia. He was saying on the hot summer nights, the people would be in this project would have little balconies. They'd sleep out on the balconies, and the ones on the first floor who didn't have balconies would sleep out in the yard. And that there were old men who you could see sit on a hot summer night, sitting outdoors into the wee hours playing cards or checkers or whatever. It was a different world.
It was a safe world.
And it was infinitely safer.
Now, what about family structure, Tom? Again, I'm quoting you. Most black children were being raised in 2-parent families in 1960. 30 years after the liberal welfare state, the great majority of black children were being raised by single parents.
Yes.
How does that? By the way, we should note that Patrick Moynihan publishes the Moynihan Report in 1965.
Yes.
And he's alarmed because the illegitimacy rate among black families is 25% then. Now, among whites, it's over a third.
Yes.
Hispanics, it's over half. And among African Americans, it's over 70%. What's going on there?
Well, this is, again, this too, you find the same thing in Britain. You find it in France and Norway. You find it in the Western world. In fact,
the dissolution of the family structure.
Oh, yeah. There are any number of Western nations where 40% of the children are raised with only one parent.
Right.
At the extremes, compared to Asian countries, at the extremes, Iceland, it's 2 out of 3 children born are raised in a single-parent home. In South Korea, it's 1 out of 66.
Wow. Wow. And so, that's the welfare state?
Yes,
it is.
Oh, you're paying. You're creating a situation where if the first of all, you're creating a situation where if the man stays there, the government will not give the woman welfare, and if he leaves, it will. And so they're paying. When you pay people not to get married, more people don't get married.
Right. Okay. So what would have happened if Lyndon Johnson, instead of becoming a liberal, had remained a crusty, tough, skeptical Texas conservative,
yes,
which is certainly the way he started his career? If Lyndon Johnson had embraced the constrained vision instead of instituting the war on poverty and the Great Society and so forth, what would the country look like today?
A lot better. You would not have the same rates of crime and so on. Because, you see, you can't have a welfare state in a democratic country unless you first have a welfare state vision. And when you buy all the assumptions of that vision, then you're buying a lot of trouble. One of the episodes I think epitomized it was in France in this case. There were knife attacks by various people from North Africa against Chinese people in some suburb of Paris. And one of the things that the attackers said, that why are you attacking the Chinese? And it wasn't because of anything the Chinese had done to them. He said, they have nice clothes and big cars. That's not fair. I mean, that's, egalitarianism as a philosophy is one thing, but the actual consequences of it mean things like resenting other people's good fortune.
Right. All right. So one response to the gap, again, I return to this gap between African Americans and other Americans, affirmative action.
Yes.
Which brings us back to your alma mater, Harvard. According to
I'll never live it down.
You'll never live it down, yes. You once told me that the principal benefit of a Harvard degree was never again having to be impressed by anybody who had a Harvard degree. Is that
Absolutely.
All right. So these are figures that were published in the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper. In the Harvard class of 2019, these are the kids who will be graduating next June, the average SAT score for black students was 2149. By the way, these are all good scores, but for black students, 2149, white students, 2218, Asian students, 2300. Well, now that must be reasonable because it's taking place at Harvard the seat of reason?
Well, that wasn't quite how I described it when I was there.
Affirmative action. Is that we ought not to be doing this?
You know, there are various laws and policies that benefit one group at the expense of another. But I think affirmative action has the distinction of being one that it harms everybody, though in different ways. And so there's a lot of evidence that there are black kids who have all the qualifications to be successes in college, who nevertheless are failures because they are systematically mismatched with institutions whose standards they don't meet, even though they may meet the standards of 80 or 90% of the colleges in America. I remember first aware of this when I was teaching at Cornell, and I found that half the black students at Cornell were on some kind of academic probation. And so I went over to the administration building and looked up the SATs of these students. The average black student at Cornell at that time scored at the 75th percentile.
Which is pretty darn good.
Yes. And so that means that in most colleges in this country, they would have no trouble, and many of them would be on the dean's list. But at Cornell, the average liberal arts student at that time was in the 99th percentile. And when you're teaching the students like that, you teach at a pace that most people of any race cannot keep up with. And it was always complained that I was assigning all kinds of reading. But heck, I'm teaching kids who are in the top 1%. They can keep up with the reading that I'm assigning.
So Cornell was taking very talented black kids and spending 4 years teaching them to feel inadequate.
Yes, and succeeding at that.
A couple quotations. These are both from the last affirmative action case to reach the Supreme Court, last big affirmative action case to reach the Supreme Court, 2003, Grutter versus Bollinger. Here's the majority opinion, which was written by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Quote, "The court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary." This upholding the use of, in a decision, 5-4 decision, upholding the use of racial preferences. Now, that's quotation one. Here's quotation two, Justice Clarence Thomas, in a dissent. Quote, "I believe that blacks can achieve in every avenue of American life without the meddling of university administrators. The court holds that racial discrimination in admission should be given another 25 years. While I agree that in 25 years these practices will be illegal, they are illegal now." Close quote. So what do you do with the argument that Justice O'Connor, writing that majority opinion, there's something with the constrained vision there. Look, we have all universities across the country are using these racial preferences as the basis of admission. The best we can hope to do is tell them they ought not to be doing it, that they should be developing other standards, and give them a clock. Is that a reasonable thing to do?
No, but it's a universal thing to do. I wrote a book about affirmative action. It was called Affirmative Action Around the World. And I made a couple of international trips at the expense of the Hoover Institution around the world to check on affirmative action. This is one of the most common arguments, and it's absolutely fallacious time and time again. The argument that like so much in the unconstrained vision, it assumes that we have a power that we do not have, cannot have, and never have had. Yeah, in England, there was a man named Scarman who was saying, "For the now, we must do this in order to." And in many countries, these programs were set up with an actual cutoff date. So it was set up in Malaysia with a cutoff date, I think, of around 1990, and in Pakistan, it was supposed to go for 10 years. Mm-hmm. None of those cutoff dates has meant a thing. These programs not only continue, they increase, they spread. So the idea that you can control the future because of these wonderful sounding words, I can't think of a country in the world where that's ever happened. In the case of Pakistan, they did have an actual cutoff date. And because the people in East Pakistan were, for whatever historical reason, way behind the people in West Pakistan. And so there's these preferences for East Pakistanis. Now, before time for this thing to expire, the East Pakistanis seceded from Pakistan and formed a new nation of
Bangladesh, right.
And the preferences continued right on because there were other groups that had been added to it. And so once you get the constituency, you can't say no to them.
I see.
But it is an argument that has never worked out anywhere that I've been able to check.
All right. So Tom Sowell says no to the welfare state, no to affirmative action. What is to be done? And now you were kind enough to share with me the galleys of your forthcoming edition of Discrimination and Disparities. Let me give you a few quotations from some of the new chapter in that book. Quote, "The poverty rate among black married couples has been less than 10% every year since 1994. As far back as 1969, young black males whose homes included newspapers, magazines, and library cards had similar incomes to those of their white counterparts. Academic outcomes show a pattern of disparities similar to the pattern of disparities in the amount of time devoted to schoolwork. Apparently, lifestyle choices have consequences."
Yes.
Close quote. So this is the constrained vision once again. Welfare state, that's government, we don't rely on that. Affirmative action, government, we don't rely on that. We rely on hard work. We rely on the institution of marriage. That's correct?
Yes, in other words, these things, I don't think it's the marriage as such or the library cards as such. It's that there are lifestyle choices that have been made. And the comparison I made was between, if you look at the poverty rate among blacks, it was 22%, and among whites it was 11%. But among black married couples, it was 7.5%.
Right.
So it's not so they not only do better than blacks as a whole, they do better than whites as a whole. And so it's lifestyle choices. Similarly with the results in some of these more successful charter schools, that you have these kids not only meeting but exceeding the national standards in places like Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant and the South Bronx. And these are not kids who are skimming the cream. They're kids chosen by lottery. They don't even test them for ability. They don't even look at their academic records. They take them into the schools and they have hard work and they make it clear at the outset, and they don't tolerate a lot of nonsensical behavior. And these kids are doing incredibly.
So, Tom, here, again, I think back to the Moynihan. Well, no, I think the Moynihan report in '65, and he was very alarmed by the illegitimacy rate of 25% among African Americans. By the way, in fairness to the late Moynihan, we should point out one reason he was alarmed by this was his own father had walked out on the family when he was 10 years old. He experienced what it meant to kids to have one parent. Okay. And now it's all gotten dramatically worse for whites and Hispanics and black, for everybody. And then I think back beyond that to your experience of Harlem. You drop out of high school and do what? Go on welfare? Start cashing? No, you went to work. And you spent some of that money to buy some inexpensive encyclopedias.
Yeah.
And the Harlem was so. But I feel this council, it's almost a council of despair in that world just seems so utterly vanished.
No question.
So your argument is if we can stand up to the welfare state, we can somehow get back to that world, a family structure will reassert itself?
Oh, that's going to be reconquering the same ground, which is very tough to do, but it can be done. I was so lucky. At the time, I had no clue about all this. I left home in 1948. Many decades later, I learned that the unemployment rate among black teenagers in 1948, 16, 17-year-olds, was 9.4%. Among whites of the same age, it was 10.2%. So both blacks and white teenagers had only a fraction of the unemployment that they have today.
You were expected to work. You were expected to be able to get a job.
And more importantly, the jobs were there for you. This is because of a fluke, really. The minimum wage law in the United States, Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, was passed with specified rates of pay that you're supposed to get. Almost immediately, inflation took off during the 1940s. So by 1948, those numbers that were in the law were meaningless.
Oh, I see.
In other words, when I started out as a Western Union messenger, the minimum wage was 40 cents an hour. I started out at the bottom at 65 cents an hour. So it was the same as if there was no minimum wage. And this is what happened. You had this, and I was so lucky. I knew, of course, had no clue about any of this. Now a black kid 20 years later comes in there. People have become compassionate. They've raised the minimum wage, so he can't get a job.
Got it.
And I don't think it does any community any good to have a whole lot of teenage males hanging around on the streets with no job and nothing to do.
Right. Tom, so, but another thought here. You're describing a world, Harlem, the urban world, gone.
Yeah.
But you made visits when you were young. You knew the South as well, didn't you? You went back to the South when you were young from time to time? I say back to the South because, as I recall, you were born in the South.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, went to New York.
Went to New York.
Yeah. Well, I think this was courtesy of the Marine Corps, which happened to locate the boot camp in South Carolina and Camp Lejeune in North Carolina.
Okay. So what I'm getting at is, you were of the generation that saw Jim Crow with your own eyes.
Oh, no question. No question.
Okay. So, well, let me read you a quotation. This is from an article that got a lot of attention in The Atlantic a couple of years ago called The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Quote, "White supremacy is a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it. Reparations is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely." Close quote. And Tom Sowell, who actually saw Jim Crow with his own eyes and experienced it, responds how?
It would be nice to know his evidence for what he said, just to be old-fashioned about it. No, it was a rotten system. But I don't know how we get from that to reparations. I mean, what we see in the United States in terms of the bad things, you see all around the world. If you were to give reparations to everyone whose ancestors had been slaves, I suspect that you would have to give reparations to more than half the entire population of the globe. Slavery was not confined to one set of races. I suspect that most of the people who were either slaves or slave owners around the world were neither white nor black. I mean, this was a universal curse of the human species.
Africa, the Middle East, Asia, slavery took place everywhere.
And it continued elsewhere long after it was abolished in the Western countries.
Right. Let me try sticking with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Shelby Steele talks about white guilt. And in Ta-Nehisi Coates, you get almost the counterpart of that, a kind of African-American claim against the white guilt. And this seems, beginning with the abolitionists, even beginning before the Civil War, you see almost every generation, there's some expression that racism and slavery, as Shelby calls it, correctly, of course, the sin of slavery is so deeply, and it's something we still live with. How do we expiate it? How do we get past it? Is there something we can do to relieve ourselves of this legacy?
Oh, I think you should repeat it. If you were a slave owner, I don't see any reason why you should feel differently. On the other hand, I can't get over the idea of A, apologizing for what B did.
Okay.
Even when they're contemporaries, much less when one is dead and the other is alive.
All right.
I mean, Scalia, I remember saying, that I owe no man anything because people who look like me did something to people who look like him.
Okay, so just get past it. Get to work.
Yeah.
All right. Tom Sowell's view is get an education, stay married, and do your job. Roughly. Yeah. All right. Charles Murray. You used to write a column every so often called Random Thoughts on the Passing Scene.
Yes.
And so I'm giving you a little snippets here of the passing scene in our final questions. Charles Murray, in his 1984 book, Losing Ground, and Charles Murray writes about discussions in academia and government about the effort to close the gap again between African Americans and whites. Quote, 1984, quote, whites had created the problem, it was up to whites to fix it, and there was very little in the dialogue that treated blacks as responsible actors, close quote.
Yes.
Has that changed?
No, it is not.
All right. On we go to the passing scene. Your friend, your longtime friend, Walter Williams. Now we come to current politics. The bottom line is that President Donald Trump does not have the personal character that we would want our children to imitate, but, save his misguided international trade policies, has turned out to be a good president. Tom?
I think his policies have been, by and large, policies that were far better than that of previous Democratic or Republican administrations.
So
I go by the consequences.
Okay.
I mean, he hasn't produced the right rhetoric, but the fact is that unemployment among low-income people, black, Hispanic included, is at a level that is far lower than it's been in decades. The economy is booming in a way that no one had predicted. People like Paul Krugman was saying that when Trump gets in, the economy is going to tank. No, the economy hit new highs.
All right.
But there are so many people among the intelligentsia, especially, who are absolutely immune to facts. It's as if they took their anti-fact shots every year, and the facts will just not affect them.
So this brings us back. I can understand. I mean, I really can. My understanding is limited, which is why I'm going to put this in the form of a question. I can understand the never-Trumpers who don't bother me with economic boom because this man is on my television screen every single night and I can't stand him. I can understand. I can see that impulse. I can understand what they feel.
This is the second consecutive president of the United States that I automatically turn off when I'm watching on television.
All right. Keep the remote right next to your hand. Okay. Who was the first?
Obama.
Got it. You're totally bipartisan in that regard, Tom.
Always. No other way.
But the Great Society, the larger point that you've been making here, the Great Society, the war on poverty, this is now 6 decades of experience.
Yes.
And we have, as you have said, the gap hasn't closed. We've got dissolution of the family structure, rising crime rates. That I don't understand. How can it be that the people, now I don't know how to remain bipartisan, but Democrats, liberals, the progressives, just are not, the evidence is in. This has not worked. Why, after more than half a century, there's still a refusal to look at the evidence?
Yes, and there's even a tendency to falsify the evidence.
And how come?
I think people become attached to a vision, and that really warps the way they see the world. Human beings have an enormous capacity to rationalize.
Yeah, all right. Again, notes on the passing scene. An article from the New York Times just a couple of days ago, quote, now this is a longish quotation, but it's important to lay out the facts here. Over the last decade, the charter school movement gained significant foothold in New York. The movement hoped to set a national example. If charter schools could make it in a deep blue state like New York, they could make it anywhere. Over 100,000 students in the city's charter schools are doing well on state tests, and tens of thousands are on waiting lists. But the election of this November, suggested that the golden era of charter schools is over. The insurgent Democrats did well across New York, but especially in the state Senate, have repeatedly expressed hostility to the movement, close quote. And Tom Sowell responds to that set of facts how?
Oh, that really is one of the moral outrages, that for many kids who are cut from a very poor background and whose parents may not have had much education, a decent education is the one thing they have to have to have a better life. And these schools have been absolutely spectacular.
The charter schools.
The charter schools. The successful ones. Now, there are a few that weren't. But, for example, a few years ago, on the statewide, New York statewide math tests, there was an elementary school, grade 4, I believe, in Harlem, whose students passed those tests at a higher rate than any fourth grade kids anywhere in the state of New York. I mean, we're talking Scarsdale, Briarcliff, places like that. The Success Academy schools as a whole, their students pass both the math and the English statewide tests at a higher rate than any school district in the entire state of New York. The vast majority of the kids in the Success Academy schools are either black or Hispanic. If you look at the 5 highest scoring school districts in the state in terms of the percentage of the students who pass the math or the English tests, their average family income ranges from four times that of the kids in the Success Academy schools to more than 9 times the family income of the kids in the Success Academy schools. And yet the mayor of New York is doing his darndest to put a stop to the expansion of schools in general, but his special ire is aimed at the Success Academy schools. And this is happening all over the country.
Because they make the teachers' unions look bad that run the public schools? What's the political motivation? Why would Mayor de Blasio have an out for the charter schools, such as Success Academy?
Well, the major reason. And we're talking about the money they contribute, the number of votes they contribute. And the schools, and what's happening, again, not just in New York, but other parts of the country, including California, is that there's all kind of chicanery to prevent the charter schools from expanding. That's why you have tens of thousands on the waiting list. Right. It's not that the charter schools aren't willing to expand, but every conceivable obstacle is put in their way. Because if you let that go at the natural pace, it would be very hard for the public schools to compete. And one of the things they're doing is imposing the same kinds of restrictions on the charter schools that made the public schools so bad. For example, restrictions on being able to get rid of kids who are running amok and ruining the education of everybody else. And the charter schools don't tolerate that. The things that are tolerated in the public schools are unbelievable.
So when I asked you a moment ago, how do we bring back the standards of the Harlem in which you grew up, the answer is that's a hard thing to do, but we do know how to do one thing. We do know how to establish schools where the kids in present-day Harlem have a shot. They have a chance of getting a good education.
Yeah, you don't have to bring back the past, even if you could, because we have it in the present. We have this happening.
And so we know how to do that, and the Democratic establishment in New York wants to shut it down.
Yes. And the Republican establishment stands mute.
Stands mute. You know, I love talking to you, but I really don't know why. It's all discouraging. Tom, you mentioned a moment ago the way young Americans flock to Bernie Sanders. Gallup poll this summer, the proportion of Americans aged 18 to 29 that holds a favorable view of capitalism, 45%. The proportion that holds a favorable view of socialism, 51%. Now, I would like you to take a look at a brief video of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who at the age of 29, calling herself a democratic socialist, has just been elected to the House of Representatives from New York. And although she's not seated yet in the new Congress, she went to Washington, and one of her first acts was to participate in a sit-in in the offices of House Majority Leader Nancy Pelosi. That is to say, the leader of her own party.
Yes.
So here's a brief video.
I just want to let you all know how proud I am of each and every single one of you for putting yourselves and your bodies and everything on the line to make sure that we save our planet, our generation, and our future. It's so incredibly important. We have to get to 100% renewable energy in 10 years. There is no other option.
Tom, to her supporters, to the supporters of Bernie Sanders, to young Americans, what would you say?
I would say get some facts first. Know what you're talking about before you start spouting out this kind of stuff. Ask the question. One of the things I do in a new book is I suggest that there's a certain opinion about what happened in the 1920s where the taxes were cut from the highest tax rate was cut down from 73% to 24%. And the argument was, oh, this is tax cuts for the rich. And I have suggested that students and that the Secretary of the Treasury did this in support of a trickle-down theory and so forth. And I suggested that the students would be a wonderful project to go read what the Secretary of the Treasury actually said.
Andrew Mellon in the 1920s,
yes,
about these tax cuts.
And then go on the internet and get the Internal Revenue official data on who paid how much taxes in the 1920s. And it turns out if you do that, you find that Andrew Mellon said that the exact opposite of what he is attributed to him in textbooks that have been sold widely for decades on end through successive editions. And what you'll find is that when the tax rate was at 73%, the people who are making over $100,000 a year, and that's maybe a couple of million in today's money, paid 30% of the taxes. And after the so-called tax cuts for the rich, they paid 65% of all the taxes. And the people with incomes under $5,000, which was a nice income in those days, who were paying 15% when the tax rate was cut, but before the tax rate was cut. And after it was cut, they paid just under 1/4% of all the taxes. And so we hear and so there's all kinds of indignation in these scholarly books. We're not talking about just political propaganda, how this was a bonanza for the rich and so on. And people with ordinary incomes paid practically nothing in income tax after the tax cuts. And millionaires, the share of millionaires was, I think, 4% before that, and it was 19% afterwards. But the facts simply do not matter. Mm-hmm. They say these words, they say trickle down, and it's like saying abracadabra, and all the miraculous things follow from that.
Tom Sowell, author of a forthcoming edition of Discrimination and Disparities, would you close by reading a brief quotation from your 1987 book, one of my favorites, A Conflict of Visions?
Logic, of course, is not the only test of a theory. Empirical evidence is crucial. And yet social visions have shown a remarkable ability to evade, suppress, or explain away discordant evidence. Historic evasions of evidence are a warning, not a model. Dedication to a cause may legitimately entail sacrifices of personal interest, but not sacrifices of mind or conscience.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, thank you.
Thank you.
For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.